case from Albert T. Gournam. It was January 3rd, 1775. Albert Timmins Gournam was a 27-year-old man whose parents had immigrated to the colonies from Poland before birthing him. His family lived in Philadelphia and was quite poor, as per usual for most immigrants back in the day. After his father was tragically killed in the sawmill accident and his mother and sister abandoned him, Albert decided to move out of Philadelphia and start scratch somewhere else. He gathered what little he had and traveled over 200 miles all the way out to the frontier, just west of the Maryland colony. By the time the new year had arrived, he decided to take residence at the small trading post of Mount Pleasant, modern-day Frostburg. The trading post wasn't anything major, and for two reasons. The first being that it was in the absolute middle of nowhere, unknown land. The second was that it wasn't near any significant landmarks. This meant that the only people who really came there were either hunters or trappers. John had a knack for trapping and decided to try his luck setting up some trap lines in the woods. It would be his only way of making a living after all. Farming wasn't really an option, as the terrain was too hilly and rocky to make it possible around the area. Not to mention, it was right in the middle of one of the coldest winters the region had recorded for a few decades. It was a dangerous location at the time too. Not only was there a threat of hostile Indians attacking, or a complete whiteout, but the British had also lurked to the east and north and could attack at any time. That was unlikely though, because this place may as well have been too far out in nowhere land, even for them. In the winter, it gets cold there to a whole new level. Snow blanketed the town as well as the surrounding hills, and rime ice covered each tree and each building. In the daytime, temperatures really never seemed to get above 25 Fahrenheit. The trading post only had a permanent population of about 50 or so people, and would attempt to trade with nearby Indian tribes to keep the place under maintenance. Throughout the spring and fall, many hunters traveled out to this frontier to hunt deer, bear, and elk. During the winter, however, all the hunters returned home, and the only people left are about 45 in total, including both permanent residents and the trappers, such as Albert, who were trying to make a living. As far as buildings go, all Mount Pleasant had is a few cabins and housed multiple people, tents for temporary residents, a small church, a watchtower, and a blacksmith. Also, I should mention just how inaccessible at the time this place was. The nearest settlement was located over 50 miles to the east, which is also just another trading post with about 100 people for its population. The path to get to Mount Pleasant was nothing more than an icy path through the wilderness that trailed the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains. On Albert's journey to Mount Pleasant, he encountered a friendly group of Algonquin Indians, who were also heading to Mount Pleasant for a rest, before making their way to make winter camp. They also went north in the summer where their fishing grounds were. They allowed Albert to travel the rest of the way with them. Albert told them about his trapping endeavors, and the Indians asked him where. Albert said he intended on heading into the northern hills, where few men have ever dared to go. The Indians heavily advised against that, saying that not even any animals went there. Any man who has traveled in that region has never returned, and those that do are said to be irrevocably insane, having gone mad. The Indians also told Albert that in the spring, when they head north again, they purposely detour around that area altogether. In their words, the area is nothing but icy hills, with dense forests, steep hollows, and icy caves, with no sign of civilization for hundreds of miles. According to the Algonquin, the icy forests of the east and the north lurks a malevolent spirit, referred to as the spirit of lonely places, that plagues the minds of travelers with thoughts of desperation and loneliness. It is said to appear only in the night and can sense the panicked heartbeat of a lost traveler from miles away. Albert was uneased for sure when they told him about that legend. He decided not to listen to them though, as after all they were just random Indians who go off on all their weird and random myths and such. Besides, he needed to make money, and he figured that the icy hills of the north of Mount Pleasant would be ideal for trapping raccoon and fox, as likely no one else has ever tried. On the day Albert finally arrived in Mount Pleasant, he attempted to find a guide to get him familiar with the area in which he'd be trapping in, but no one agreed to go with him because, in their words, no man has attempted to venture out there, meaning there were no guides to begin with. This intrigued Albert even more, as he was now sure that there would be bountiful populations of raccoon and fox out there, even more so if no one has ever trapped up there before. One man, however, told him that there were rumors of a cabin deep within those hills. Apparently the man who built it vowed never to return. He had been willing to venture out there, as it'd be predicted to be a few days' walk to get to said cabin, and so Albert was ecstatic. Not only did he have uncharted territory to explore and trap in, he also had a pre-built cabin to stay in, unlike most trappers who slept in their canvas tents. Albert spent the first night in a canvas tent by the trading post, and planned on setting out into the wilderness the very next morning. Here is an account from Albert, as he wrote in his journal. He was taught to write at an early age, due to his mother being a school teacher for wealthier kids. This explains Albert's near-perfect grammar, something almost unheard of for a commoner in this time period. And just a heads up, Albert never made it out of those hills. His journal was found by land surveyors over 100 years later. I awoke on a clear morning. As per usual, my toes and fingers were numb from the start, so I brewed some coffee to warm up, along with a small fire. It was so cold outside that even the smallest breath looked like the greatest exhale. I joined some other men who were also embarking on a trapping expedition that same day, and ate breakfast with them. They informed me that unlike myself, who was going solo, they were members of the American Fur Company, one of the largest companies in the New World, and were to set trapping lines along the north ridges of the Allegheny Plateau. They were staying in Mount Pleasant for a rest, before heading south, into Virginia's frontier. I was eager to tell them my endeavors, but rather than them reacting with admiration and respect, they acted like I was talking about a land that now ceases to exist. I pointed to the ridges north of Mount Pleasant, and they just looked back at me blankly. They said that they had never heard of any man who had considered venturing into that area. The natives stayed out of it, and therefore they followed suit. I will show them. I will not let some random Indian legends and superstitions keep me from making my money. I need money. I need it desperately. I will return back 1 month from now in February with the largest collection of pelts south of the Hudson River. I gathered my tent, blanket, rifle, and trapping gear and set off. I have only about 1 week's worth of hardtack on me to eat. I will need to find food soon, though I do not expect it to be easy. These winter woods are sparse. I crossed a frozen creek via a bridge and set off up a steep mountainside. The path was not at all visible because of the snow. Not to mention the further I walked, the less path there was. I rounded a turn in the valley and the trading post that was inside Mount Pleasant was out of sight. The dense oak and hickory trees of the hillsides stood like giants above me. All sound was silenced, and the only colors visible to my eye were the blue of the clear sky, the ashy gray of the barren hardwoods, and the white of the blanket snow that only got deeper the higher up the plateau I walked. I wouldn't consider myself cold anymore. The hill was so steep, and the snow so deep, I began sweating profusely. I didn't want to stop walking because I also didn't want to risk my hands going numb again. Soon, I had made it to the top of a plateau and/or a ridge. I glanced behind from where I'd come and could not see the town anymore. The mountain I had just walked up blocked it from view. I then looked ahead of me. Nothing. The view was gorgeous, but consisted of nothing more than ridges covered in dense hardwoods and evergreens. No towns, no villages, no trading posts. To be honest, as I walked I was kind of hoping for any signs of people, even if it be an Indian camp or anything like that. But no, there was a lack of anything. Though, it should be a good thing that now I had likely hundreds of miles of uncharted wilderness to explore and set traps in. Before I did that, though, I needed to finish the trek to the alleged cabin. I really hoped the story with the cabin was true. I'll give it a few days' chance for myself to find it. If it is not found by me by then, I'll just have to make my own camp. As I continued following the path along the ridge, I noticed weathered axe markings in some of the oak trees that looked like they'd been there for a very long time. I assumed that whoever built the cabin left these markings there so he could get back to it, and so I followed these markings. They led me away from the more ridge-like terrain and into a more leveled-out forest, consisting of mostly beech and maple. I decided to find somewhere to sleep for the night, as the sun was getting low on the horizon. Before I knew it, it was dusk. Night after night, the sun cast an eerie glow that reflected off the snow, creating a deep purple twilight. It only strengthens the sense of total isolation that encompasses the land after sundown. As the sun slipped out of sight, I lit my campfire, using a flint and steel. I ate what little I could afford to eat that night, and laid out under the stars. Once my fire died out, the cold really began to set in. I don't remember sleeping a wink that night, because of the combination of the cold plus the deep silence that surrounded me. There was no wind, nor were they forest animals to provide any noise, as it was winter. A.T. Gournam. I awoke freezing as usual. I strongly believed that this morning was colder than the previous. Before I packed up my gear, I walked hastily in circles around the vicinity of which I slept, so as to thaw out my feet. As I paced, however, I saw unrecognizable footprints in the snow. They looked like nothing I had ever seen in my life, like a combination of elk and a human, with claws on the end. My father would always take me trapping in the woods when I was a little boy, so I was certainly familiar with what certain game tracks would look like. The detail about these tracks that put me off the most, though, was the fact that they appeared as if they consistently were walking on 2 legs, and not all 4s. The distance between steps was also unheard of. They measured about a rough estimate of 5 to 7 feet per step. They went around in circles near about 50 yards from where I slept. before retreating down the hill and into a super thick grove of hemlocks. This discovery certainly put me on edge. I then remembered the group of Algonquins and what they had told me 2 days earlier. I snapped myself out of believing that, though, and got going. I just wanted to get to that cabin, as even though I walked with great haste today, I still couldn't seem to warm up to any extent. Soon, I crossed a creek and began up a hemlock-covered hill, still following the axe markings in the trees. This hill seemed to go on seemingly forever. Whenever I thought I had reached the top, it would continue going up farther. Soon, though, I did make it to the top. The tree markings led me right back down the hill and into a dense hollow. The forest sat so incredibly silent that even the sound of my footfalls became a dread to hear, the deafening silence of the woods only amplifying them. Once I got to the bottom of the hollow, I found myself near a mountain stream with dense rhododendron bushes to my sides, and tall spruce and pines towering over above me. The stream was obviously frozen all the way solid. I followed this creek upstream and therefore uphill. Then I entered into what I would likely consider to be a ravine. The walls of either side of said ravine were sheer rock cliffs. Birch trees grew out of the crevices and massive icicles hung over 25 feet long down from the rocks. Sometimes these icicles would create a cave-like phenomenon. I became curious and was tired, so I decided to take a break in the largest ice cave that I could find. To my shock, however, I discovered upon entering behind the ice that this was far more than simply a rock overhang with icicles hanging in front. The cave actually carved back deep into the earth. I didn't have a lantern, and so I decided to light a small fire and use a stick wedged with birch bark in the middle to make a torch. I then ventured into the cave. I didn't have to go far inside until I came across weird drawings on the walls that depicted creatures with enlarged figures, like ones out of their hands or an enlarged head with extremely long fingers. They appeared quite disturbing, and if I am being totally transparent, on the ground I found bones scattered in the frozen dirt and traces of rotting flesh still on them. I remember the air going putrid and stale. I stomped out my torch and fled the cave. I was overcome with nothing but overwhelming dread. I cannot come to explain, nor bring myself to do so, and that feeling still sits with me as I sit here writing this. I gathered my things and got away from that cave. I, with all honesty, wanted nothing more than to find that cabin, where I would be safe. I could not explain how I felt today. The tree markings led me through the ravine for several more hours. Night fell, and I was still trapped down there, as climbing those rock walls would be a task impossible to accomplish. I was terrified as I could no longer see my surroundings, the valley making it even darker, even faster. Not wanting to spend another night out in the open, I took shelter in the crevice within the rock. I barricaded all entrances until I was completely enclosed. I wasn't as cold as I had been the nights previous, but I was still shook. I remembered the strange footprints in the snow from the morning before. I remembered the Indian legends, and I remembered the cave drawings from only a few hours previous. A.T. Gournam. I awoke absolutely beyond exhausted. It was no longer sunny outside that morning. A blizzard had seemed to be in the making. This gave me further incentive to make progress to the cabin. I hoped that I'd make it to the cabin that day, as I had previously been told that the cabin was a 3 days' journey. I gathered my items and began trekking through the now 2-foot deep snow. The tree markings were harder to follow that day, because the snow also stuck to the sides of the tree trunks. I still walked through the ravine, but soon was led out of there and into a stand of black birch trees. They stood on a slight slant above the ravine, but with a steep mountain hill behind them. In the middle of said stand was the alleged cabin at long last. It was still a few yards away, so I walked and got closer. The cabin was small, made out of birchwood. To my surprise, it was in quite solid condition, and the log was like new, freshly hewn. It consisted of only one small room, and inside was a wooden floor, small bed, a wood stove, and a chest for storage. There was one door and one window. I was beyond relieved to have made it to the cabin, as it had been a long and uncertain journey. The blizzard outside was now picking up, causing the wind to blow even harder, the temperature to drop even colder, and the snow to pile up even higher. I reasoned a plan that I would hunker down inside this here cabin until the storm had passed. I needed food to eat, as I was running out of hardtack, so once the weather permitted, I must go out to set my trap lines. I had no means of telling time without a clock. I estimated it to be close till noon. I ate what little I had for lunch, saving what I had for dinner and breakfast later. I decided that worst case be, my trap lines failed, causing me to run out of food, and I will make the trek back to Mount Pleasant. Starving was not an option, so my trap lines needed to work, and fast. I would save the pelts for trading and eat the meat for myself. I wanted to wait until tomorrow, when I hoped for the blizzard to pass, to set my traps. But I also heard word from a group of French explorers that even during the winter months, game, both large and small, still are active during the night. There was no possibility of me traveling back outside now, as I had just gotten here and the blizzard was still at its worst. Hopefully in the evening the blizzard will ease up a bit and allow me to set my traps, because I reasoned with myself that waiting to set trap lines until tomorrow would simply be nothing more than a night wasted in terms of potentially catching any pelts, though food, more importantly. I spent the rest of the afternoon hours writing today's words. I'm just here, all by myself in this lonely wilderness. Even though I am protected from the outside air, I am tired, cold, and hungry. I am desperate for food. I have no options besides to set my traps. So that's what I did. I am worried, though, because relating to what the Algonquin told me, I hadn't seen one creature out here. But I must try, at least. The blizzard was still raging infinitely outside. I had no choice, however, but to go and set up my traps. After all, the more time they were set, the more chance I had of catching something, even if it be a meager squirrel. I ate pretty much what was left of my food. I then immediately set outside to set the trap lines. It was certainly darker than it was earlier. Even though I was in theory doing myself a favor to set the traps now instead of tomorrow, I still regret not going to do it earlier, whilst I still had more daylight. I guess that it was a gamble. I chose the most flat area I could find. I did, however, have to travel outside of the birch grove to find a better area to set the traps. I eventually came across an enormous forest consisting of poplar trees. I reasoned that these would be perfect, as animals such as squirrels and fox often like to use these trees as nesting sites, their massive height making them a great hiding spot from bears or lynx. I set a few lines there, as well as a few snares in a big circle, surrounding the area of which I had set the lines at. Setting these traps happened to have taken longer than I realized. I had made a wise choice of bringing a lantern from the cabin with me, as now I could see, only barely, a thing in front of me. I lit the lantern and decided that I needed to head back to the cabin at that moment, the same sense of dread that overcame me that I'd felt the day previous. The dim flame from the lantern barely gave me any light, but it helped a little nonetheless when it came to seeing in front of me. I walked farther from the cabin than I initially thought. This time, I didn't have any axe markings on the trees to help me find my way. It was pitch black, and the insanely heavy snowfall made it near impossible for me to decipher any direction. My heart began beating rapidly as I panicked. I was lost. I walked around hastily for around 10 minutes, my fingers becoming numb by the second due to the cold. The ear-ringing silence that night was then broken by a faint groaning noise, coming from afar in the distance. I froze in my tracks. It was low in pitch, as well as in frequency, and from what I could tell, the sound still sends shivers down my spine as I write about it. It was long and drawn out, too, as it lasted somewhat of 45 seconds. It was as if a child and a bull had combined into one. My heart began beating faster, and I picked up my pace. Before I knew it, I was in nothing more than short of a full-on sprint, in a mad effort to relocate the cabin. I ran, but the cabin never came into my view. I eventually could run for no longer, and collapsed to the cold, snowy ground out of exhaustion. I lied there for some time, barely being able to breathe. I was exhausted, but still frightened. The forest remained silent. I lied in that same spot for another 5 or so minutes, until I heard it. The snap of a tree branch off in the distance. It was loud, and echoed through the soundless night. It immediately had me startled, as it had been the only sound, other than that groan, that had not been made by me for the entire time I'd been out here. I wasted time no more. I sprang back up onto my feet and ran. I just ran more and more, until finally, by some miracle, made it back to the cabin. I bolted inside and barricaded the door behind me with a table. I sat inside the pitch-black cabin and listened outside. The faint glow from the full moon cast an ominous glow through the window. The silhouettes of the scraggly birch trees cast onto the floor. Outside, I began hearing the sound of footfalls crunching in the snow. Besides my heavy breathing, it was the only sound I could hear. The footfalls slowly circled the cabin. Shortly, I reassured myself that it had to be only a bear or something. I reckoned that I better step outside and try to scare the animal off, or take a shot at it with my rifle or something. I stepped onto the porch and fully expected to witness a large animal of any kind waiting out there, but there was nothing. The footfalls could no longer be heard, and I couldn't see a thing. Amazingly, the snow had stopped and the sky held clear, hence the moonlight shining through the forest. Even though I saw nothing, I had the utmost, strongest feelings of a presence, that something was out there, watching me. I hurriedly locked myself back inside. I figured that with all this time isolated and alone in the wilderness, my mind inevitably would start toying with me. I was the most tired I'd ever been in my entire 27 years of existence after all. I decided just to turn over and go to sleep. I kept feeling as if I could fall asleep in bed, but something just kept me up and I did not know what to do. It was getting cold inside the cabin again, and so I decided to relight the wood stove to warm things up. I could hardly feel my hands and feet, so striking my flint was a huge effort in of itself. Soon, the flames from the fire gave the dim lighting to the cabin's interior. I turned away from the wood stove and back towards the window, near where the cabin was located. I felt like throwing up as soon as I caught a glimpse of the putrid and horrifying sight before me. Standing in the window was a human-like figure. They were the skinniest I'd ever seen a creature be, and their skin was whiter than snow. The part that drew the line, however, was its face. The dim light from the fire highlighted it perfectly. It was one of pure evil. It had decaying flesh around its mouth, which had blood dripping from it. Its skin was tight, yet wrinkly, with an ashy gray hue. Its eyes were jet black, no bigger than half an inch in diameter. It held a wicked grin, revealing pointy, decaying teeth. It looked very similar to the head of fellow man. It pressed its unearthly long hands against the window and began to tap on it, slowly, extremely lightly. I fell to the floor in pure fright and hid under the bed. I heard the faint tapping at the window, located just above where the bed was. I had no clue if the creature saw me yet. I was too frightened to even breathe, and felt like I was going to pass out due to the holding of my breath. Seconds felt like hours as the tapping dragged on. As the creature continued to tap, a strange and pungent odor began to fill the air around me, which now felt dull and thick. I looked and could see ice everywhere, even though I was inside the cabin. The tapping slowed down greatly to the point where eventually the sound only occurred once every 2 or so minutes. Each time hearing the sound instilled even more fear than it had before. I dared not to move underneath of the small bed. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because when I next opened my eyes, it was morning. A.T. Gournam. I crawled out from underneath the bed and stood up. Intense cramps overcame me, however, from crouching in such a position all night long. I cannot come to say how relieved, though, I was to see the early rays of the sun peeking just over the ridge to the east of the trees. It reflected off the virgin snow of the ground, creating for the very first time in days, other than the cabin, a quite welcoming sight. I lit up the wood stove to warm up. I had ran out of food by now, so my last and only resort was to set the traps that I had set. After I had deemed myself to be warm enough to get the day started, I decided then to venture outside and over to the poplar trees to check my trap lines. As I slid on my pair of boots, though, I remembered the previous night. How could I not remember it? I stepped out into the frigid morning and walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for the footprints of the monster that had paid me a visit. But I found nothing, not a trace. Was I hallucinating? Was I dreaming? But I know I wasn't. I could feel its presence last night. I saw it at my window, and I saw those eyes. It all seemed very real to me, and I knew what was there. I decided that I may as well check my trap lines and see if I'd caught anything. I had a gut feeling, though, that there would be nothing, and unfortunately I was right. My traps were all empty, though all but one. It was located at the base of an aspen tree where I had set one of the snares. I had set it last night, and apparently had been triggered. There was no animal on it, though. The wires of my trap had bloodstains on them, as well as the snow surrounding the trap. The way these traps should work is not to kill the animal, only trap it, even though it would likely freeze to death between the time of its entanglement and coming to get it. Something had to have been through here last night that killed my catch. Instantly, my thoughts went right back to the entity at my window the previous night. That had to have been it. I still was bewildered, however, as even my trap lines were no footprints present anywhere around them. Was this some sort of ghost? If it was a ghost, how did it kill whatever was in my snare? I continued walking near the area of my trap lines, hoping to find some clarity as to what was going on, or to what it was that kept on terrorizing me out there in the wilderness. However, as I walked the area and happened to gaze down the hill, it was a thick grove of hemlocks, and I witnessed a strange-like creature walking through the grove. It was thin as paper and took insanely long strides of what estimated to be upwards of 15 to 20 feet. It stopped in its tracks and looked at me. I recognized that face. That same wicked grin and the same jet black eyes with matted gray hair. It stood around 15 feet tall, and it got on its hind legs. Had previously had been walking on all fours, like a bear or like a lynx. It faced me, and then let out a deafening scream, which echoed into the vast ocean of trees. I was sent running immediately in the opposite direction of it, which involved me dashing up the hill and onto a flat plateau. I continued running until I could no longer. I vomited from fright and from exhaustion. I did not stop, though. Screams could still be heard echoing from back where I'd come. They sounded closer by each passing minute. I ran until I come across something. Anything. I did, however, come across one thing. I was in the middle of a dense forest of pine trees when I came across the remnants of what appeared to be an abandoned Indian camp. I could tell the camp used to be in a clearing, but was no longer, due to the new age growth pine trees which had begun to grow back. There were around 5 wigwams and 1 longhouse, and nothing much else. besides a few fire rings. It appeared to be a group of hunters, or maybe even trappers, such I had come here to make a living. But obviously either didn't succeed, or were potentially driven off by something. They both seemed like reasons to leave, but as of the current moment, the latter seemed the most reasonable. I could no longer hear the deafening screams of the creature following me, and figured I was safe. But I didn't feel like it though. I felt absolutely awful. Absolutely awful. That sense of dread still rich in my body. Out of pure fright and of pure instinct, I hid in one of the wigwams to try and get some rest, and that is where I sit now as I write this story, word for word. I spend the next 5 minutes regaining control of my breath, too wrapped up inside my own head to notice the overwhelming scent of rotting flesh. That was it. That undeniably recognizable metallic scent of blood. Next, I looked to the ground and felt my stomach tighten into 1,000 knots, and felt like vomiting once more. On the floor of the wigwam were deceased corpses of what appeared to be 2 dead Indian men. They were in the most mutilated state I'd ever seen a living creature to be, let alone a human. Their ribs were torn open, what looked like violent force. They were both missing multiple limbs, and one of the men was missing his tongue. The other man had no eyes, and his bowels and intestines were sat in a massive heaping pile on top of his stomach. I do not know what to do as I am seeing. Night is falling, hungry, lonely, and this here is precisely where Albert abruptly stopped writing. Again, the land surveyors didn't find his journal until over 100 years later, and took them another year to decipher what it read, as the paper was in terrible shape and needed to be carefully configured to find the meaning of the above passage. The journal was around roughly 160 yards away from the abandoned Indian camp, although, as of then, one cannot really tell there used to be a camp there. It was all wrecked and destroyed. The surveyors argued and argued about what Albert T. Gournam was going through out in the wilderness that winter. They could all agree on one thing for sure, however. Albert had gone mad, and they were right. But I'll explain more perhaps on why that is here soon. The surveyors, along with the governor of Frostburg, or in the time Mount Pleasant, and even fellow trappers who went venturing into the most remote sections of wilderness one can imagine on the frontier of America, all agree that the isolation, combined with the lack of food, and the freezing winter temperatures and the long nights, could very well be why Albert T. Gournam had gone insane. However, other groups of people, they tell a different story. The word on what the land surveyors found in the wilderness quickly spread throughout the local region, and the discovery even reached some people who were left with the diminishing indigenous population. They took a great interest in the case and claimed that Albert had been a victim as what is known by many of the tribes who inhabit eastern North America as a Cacawana tickler. The surveyors asked more about this so-called Cacawana tickler, and over the next few hours were told everything the natives knew about the topic. I will summarize here the basic details about the Cacawana tickler, before going into detail about what really happened to Albert T. Gournam after he stopped writing on that lonely wilderness day. The Cacawana tickler is an evil Native American spirit that takes residence in the minds of the deprived and lonely, especially of individuals who drift away from the group and are overcome with loneliness, also why it is usually referred to as the spirit of the lonely places. Tribes residing in the regions of the eastern forest regions of Canada and the northeastern United States are most susceptible to becoming possessed by this spirit, and is only attracted by what I mentioned above, i.e., deprivation and loneliness. But is most often brought about during the most terrible act of evil, tickle. It lurks in the lands where no man sets foot, and appears only in the night. Traditionally, it appears in spirit form, but can manifest itself into a physical being, aka the remnants of a person who had fallen victim to it. The spirit has the ability to plague the minds of a lost person who has become lost and or found themselves trapped in an extended period with a group of people. This phenomenon is called Cacawana tickler psychosis, where it fills the minds of those fallen victim to it with thoughts of tickle and desperation. The person then truly believes that he or she will become a tickler themselves, and the urge to continue tickling fellow men is too strong more often than not. It is most likely how the physical beings of the spirit have come into exist. They will forever lurk in the wilderness and are always hungry, never satisfied with their tickles. Its desperation and loneliness is said to have a direct impact on the person's and creature's appearance. Shortly after Albert stopped writing, he got up and ran into the ever-darkening night. He ran, feeling as if he was hunted. He continued hearing a call being his own voice off in the distance. And so, he continued running, only this time, towards it. Soon, he came upon a boulder field amongst a forest of tall maple trees. He disappeared inside and found a small rock crevice. He curled inside there and began tickling his own flesh. Soon enough, half his forearm was missing. His eyes went jet black as he went to venture out in search of more food to tickle. For now, His appetite for tickle can never be fulfilled. Eventually, he found himself back near the abandoned Indian camp and finished off the remains of the 2 Indian men, and no one ever heard from him again, as he had never reemerged from that wilderness.